The most expensive mistake a man can make is believing he still owns a woman he already lost. Ethan Carter stood in the glass-walled lobby of Carter Group's headquarters, a crisp envelope in his hand, the gold-embossed wedding invitation catching the morning light like a trophy he hadn't earned yet. Employees passed by in silence, none of them daring to interrupt the moment as he adjusted his cufflinks and smiled at the thought of what today would mean. Across the city, Eva Johnson sat in a quiet cafe, her presence unremarkable to anyone watching, a simple black coat resting over her shoulders, a cup of coffee untouched as her phone lit up with his name. When she saw the invitation message, there was no shock, no tremor, no hesitation, only a pause so calm it almost felt unreal. Ethan had sent it personally, not out of kindness, but out of certainty that she would come, that she would sit in the audience and watch him step into a new life without her, that she would remain exactly where he had left her, behind him. But Eva did not move like someone who was left behind. She read every word once, then set the phone down as if it belonged to someone else's story and simply said to herself, "I see." Years ago, she had known this version of Ethan when ambition was still soft and uncertain, when late nights and handwritten plans were all they had, and she had been the one refining his vision while he signed his name on her work. There were nights she stayed awake until 3 de la mañana, fixing errors no one thanked her for, believing that building something together meant building something equal. But the quality had slowly disappeared, replaced by silence, distance, and a door closing behind her without explanation. Now, in the present, Ethan Carter believed he was inviting his past into a public stage of triumph, not realizing that some pasts do not return empty. Ava finally stood from her seat, placing a single bill on the table, her reflection steady in the window glass as if she were already somewhere else entirely. In a high-rise office miles away, a screen flickered briefly with encrypted data and a name only a few executives had ever seen in full authorization, Johnson Holdings. And somewhere deep inside Carter Group's future projections, numbers began to shift in ways no one had yet noticed. That evening, Ethan rehearsed his smile in front of a mirror, unaware that the woman he expected to watch his wedding was not coming to remember him, but to understand exactly how much of his world already belonged to her. The city looked different when seen from the top floor of a building that no longer needed permission to exist. Ava Johnson stood in silence behind floor-to-ceiling glass, her reflection layered over a skyline that pulsed with early evening light. In front of her, a white table of polished wood stretched across a private executive suite, where documents moved quietly between hands of senior advisors who did not speak unless spoken to. Every screen in the room displayed the same company name, Carter Group, along with layers of financial data, acquisition models, and projected outcomes that had already been approved in principle. No one in the room questioned the pace, because they all understood what very few outside these walls knew. Ava was not rebuilding her life. She was reorganizing an entire ecosystem that had once underestimated her. Years earlier, when she was still inside a different version of herself, she had been the silent architect behind systems others took credit for, solving structural failures in products that had made millions for people who never asked who fixed them. After the separation, she did not collapse into absence. She expanded into precision. Degrees were earned quietly, partnerships were formed without headlines, and capital moved through channels that never touched public attention. By the time her name appeared in legal registries tied to Johnson Holdings, she was no longer someone returning. She was someone arriving for the first time in full authority. On the table in front of her now was a report labeled confidential, outlining Carter Group's current vulnerability points, not as weaknesses to be exploited emotionally, but as structural inefficiencies in leadership, liquidity, and long-term strategy. One of her advisors spoke carefully, noting that the upcoming public event hosted by Carter Group would provide the perfect visibility window for final consolidation steps. Ava did not react immediately. Instead, she adjusted a simple pen between her fingers, studying the name Ethan Carter on the document as if it belonged to a distant chapter rather than a present concern. There was no anger in her expression, only a kind of stillness that came from complete understanding. She remembered him differently, not as the man preparing a wedding, but as the younger version who once believed ambition alone was enough to hold everything together. That belief had built something real, but incomplete. And incompleteness, she had learned, always invited correction. Across the city, Ethan stood inside his own glass office, reviewing seating arrangements and guest confirmations for the upcoming ceremony. His world was structured in confidence, every detail curated to reflect success. He had no reason to question the stability of his position, no reason to suspect that the company he considered his greatest achievement was already entangled in decisions he had never been invited to witness. When his assistant mentioned a pending corporate notification from a major holding group, he barely looked up, assuming it was routine investment communication. Meanwhile, Eva closed the file in front of her and stood, signaling the end of the meeting with a simple nod that carried more weight than any announcement. As the room emptied, she remained alone for a moment, looking out at the city that belonged equally to those who built it and those who quietly understood how it could be reshaped. Her phone lit up again with a reminder of the wedding invitation still saved in her inbox. She did not open it. Instead, she turned away toward a corridor lined with glass and steel, where every step she took echoed with certainty rather than memory. Somewhere beneath the surface of celebration and ignorance, the final stage of alignment had already begun, and the man who believed he had invited his past to witness his future had unknowingly placed that future directly in her hands. The morning of the event arrived with a kind of stillness that felt too precise to be accidental, as if the entire city had unknowingly agreed to witness something it did not yet understand. Inside the Carter Group headquarters, Ethan Carter moved through his office with controlled excitement, adjusting his tie in front of a reflective glass panel that doubled as a display screen showing final event logistics, guest arrivals, and media coordination. Everything appeared perfect on the surface, carefully curated to reflect success, stability, and control. His assistant confirmed that the venue had been fully prepared and that the guest list included influential executives, investors, and media representatives from across the country. Ethan nodded with satisfaction, his attention fixed on the idea that tonight would reinforce everything he believed he had built with his own hands. Across the city, Eva Johnson stood in a private preparation suite high above the streets, the space quiet except for the soft movement of fabric as she adjusted a simple, elegant outfit chosen not for attention, but for presence. There was no urgency in her movements, only precision, as if she were preparing not for an event, but for a conclusion already written long before today. On the table beside her, a single tablet displayed real-time market activity tied to Carter Group, alongside internal indicators only accessible through secure authorization layers. Subtle shifts had already begun, though none of them were visible to those who still believed they were in control. A senior advisor entered quietly, confirming that all systems were aligned and that the final authorization step would occur during the evening ceremony. Ava listened without interruption, her expression unchanged, her thoughts not on celebration but on timing. She remembered nothing with emotion, only with clarity, as if every moment from the past had been catalogued for this exact sequence of outcomes. Years ago, she had once believed that success required visibility, that recognition was the natural result of effort, but experience had taught her something far more efficient. Real power did not announce itself. It simply waited until it was structurally unavoidable. Meanwhile, Ethan reviewed the final guest confirmations again, pausing briefly on Eva Johnson's name as it appeared on the official attendance list. He leaned back slightly, a faint smile forming, interpreting her presence as confirmation of closure rather than complexity. In his mind, she was still part of a chapter that had already ended, someone returning only to witness what she had lost. He did not question why her RSVP had been immediate, nor why there had been no attempt to decline or negotiate her attendance. Instead, he focused on the evening ahead, where every detail had been designed to reinforce a narrative of personal achievement and public validation. As the afternoon light shifted across the city, Eva stepped into a waiting vehicle without ceremony. There were no headlines, no escorts, no visible signs of importance, only quiet movement through traffic that carried her toward a destination already shaped by unseen decisions. Inside the vehicle, she reviewed a final sequence of confirmations, each one marked with timestamps and authorization codes that connected directly to corporate governance structures far beyond Carter Group's public perception. When the vehicle slowed near the venue, she looked out at the building where the evening would unfold, its exterior glowing softly under controlled lighting, guests already beginning to arrive, unaware of the invisible foundation beneath the moment they were about to experience. She did not feel anticipation in the way others might. Instead, there was a sense of completion forming quietly beneath the surface of thought, as if every step she had taken since the past separation had been moving toward a single point of convergence. Inside, Ethan greeted early guests with practiced confidence, unaware that the structure supporting his confidence was no longer solely his to define. And as Abba's presence drew closer to the entrance, the final layer of separation between perception and reality was about to disappear, leaving only the truth that neither celebration nor preparation had yet fully acknowledged. The entrance of the venue was already alive with controlled elegance as guests arrived under soft golden lighting that reflected off polished marble floors and towering glass panels, each detail carefully arranged to project an image of celebration and success. Inside, Ethan Carter moved through the crowd with practiced ease, shaking hands, exchanging polite laughter, and accepting compliments that reinforced the narrative he had built around himself. Every interaction felt like confirmation that tonight belonged to him, that every step he had taken had led to this exact moment of recognition. He paused occasionally to glance toward the entrance, expecting to see Ava Johnson arrive as part of the audience he believed still belonged to his past. In his mind, her presence would serve as closure, a quiet acknowledgement of the life he had moved beyond. What he did not realize was that every assumption he held about that evening was already misaligned with a reality he could not yet see. Outside the main hall, Ava Johnson stepped out of a private vehicle without urgency, her movements calm and deliberate as the city lights framed her silhouette in quiet contrast to the energy inside. There were no attempts to draw attention, no visible display of importance, only a presence that did not require validation. As she approached the entrance, security personnel checked her name against the guest list, finding it marked in a way that did not match standard categorization. After a brief moment of uncertainty, she was allowed through without interruption, as if the system itself deferred to an authority it did not fully understand. Inside, the atmosphere shifted subtly as she entered, though most guests did not register why. Conversations continued, glasses were raised, and music played softly in the background, but something in the rhythm of the room adjusted without announcement. Ethan, standing near the center of attention, turned slightly as movement near the entrance caught his eye. For a brief moment, he did not recognize her immediately in the context of the space she now occupied. Abba did not move toward him, nor did she acknowledge the attention of others. Instead, she paused just inside the threshold, taking in the environment with quiet observation, as if reviewing a space she had already studied in. They did long before stepping into it physically. A tense expression shifted as recognition formed, followed quickly by a sense of satisfaction he did not bother to conceal. He believed this moment confirmed what he had anticipated, that she had come as a witness to his success, nothing more than a reminder of a past he had already surpassed. He excused himself from a nearby conversation and began to walk toward her with measured confidence, adjusting his posture as if preparing for a familiar exchange. Around them, guests began to notice the interaction, their attention gradually shifting without clear understanding of why it felt significant. Ava remained still, her expression unchanged, her focus not on Ethan but on the environment around him, observing patterns of influence, seating arrangements, and the subtle hierarchy that defined the room. Every detail was recorded in her mind with precision rather than emotion. Ethan stopped a few steps away from her, offering a polite smile that carried the tone of closure rather than curiosity. He spoke lightly, referencing the past in a way that suggested distance had made it irrelevant. Abba listened without interruption, her silence uninterrupted by expectation or reaction. In that silence, something unspoken began to shift in the room, not through words, but through the simple imbalance between assumption and reality. Being them, the stage lights dimmed slightly as the final preparations for the evening program began, and a staff member quietly moved toward the podium with a document marked for official announcement. No one yet understood that the structure of the evening was about to transition from celebration into disclosure, and that every belief held by those present would soon be redefined by a truth that had already been set in motion long before the first guest arrived. The room had settled into a rhythm of controlled elegance, where every laugh sounded rehearsed and every glance carried the weight of unspoken expectations, yet beneath that surface calm, something subtle was beginning to shift in ways no one could yet name. Ethan Carter stood beside Ava Johnson, maintaining a posture of casual authority as if the space between them still belonged to his understanding of the past. He spoke in light tones, referencing memories that once felt significant to him, as though time had only softened their meaning rather than rewritten them entirely. Eva listened without interruption, her expression steady, her attention not anchored to his words but to the structure of the room itself, reading it the way an architect reads a building that may or may not still be standing correctly. Around them, guests continued to observe in fragments, their attention drifting in and out as social conversation attempted to mask curiosity. Ethan, still convinced of his narrative, made a subtle gesture toward the gathering, implying that her presence here was simply a courtesy, a final acknowledgement of a shared history that had already reached its conclusion. He smiled lightly, expecting a similar response, expecting recognition of distance, of closure, of hierarchy. But Eva did not respond to that expectation. Instead, she shifted her gaze slightly toward the stage, where staff members moved with increasing precision, preparing the final segment of the evening program. A faint announcement echoed through discreet speakers, indicating that a formal corporate statement would follow the celebration segment, though most guests did not register its significance. Ethan barely noticed it at all, still focused on the moment in front of him, still interpreting Ava's silence as emotional restraint rather than strategic awareness. Then, without warning, a shift occurred in the room's attention. It began quietly, almost imperceptibly, as staff members adjusted their positions and security personnel subtly changed their stance near the stage. A senior coordinator stepped into view holding a sealed document folder marked with corporate authorization seals that did not belong to the event itself. Conversations began to slow as guests sensed the transition from celebration to announcement, though no one yet understood its purpose. Ethan finally turned his attention away from Eva and toward the stage, his expression tightening slightly as he noticed the formality of the moment increasing. Ava, however, remained still, as if she had already arrived at this moment long before anyone else in the room. The coordinator reached the podium and placed the document down with deliberate care, scanning the audience once before speaking in a calm and official tone. He announced that a final governance update from a major holding entity would now be disclosed, referencing a controlling interest adjustment that affected the corporate structure of Carter Group. A quiet ripple moved through the audience as the words began to register, though comprehension lagged behind attention. Ethan frowned slightly, exchanging a brief glance with one of his executives, sensing that something in the tone of the evening had shifted away from celebration. Ava's presence, still quiet and composed beside him, now felt different in a way he could not immediately define. The coordinator continued, stating that the controlling authority had exercised a scheduled activation clause tied to long-standing equity arrangements, and that the final designation of ownership would now be formally recognized. At that moment, the room fell into a deeper silence, as if every guest collectively understood that the evening had moved beyond ceremony into consequence. A tense smile faded, replaced by a focused stillness as he tried to process what he was hearing, while Eva remained unchanged, her calmness no longer reading as indifference but as confirmation of something already concluded. The document on the podium was opened slowly, and the next words were about to define the direction of everything that followed, though no one in the room was yet prepared for the name that would be spoken. The silence that followed the opening of the sealed document felt heavier than any applause that had filled the room earlier that evening, as if the air itself had been recalibrated to carry a different kind of truth. Ethan Carter stood rigid near the front of the hall, his earlier confidence replaced by a controlled stillness that no longer served as confidence but as restraint. Around him, guests remained frozen in place, their attention fully captured by the podium where the senior coordinator continued reading with professional calm. The words being spoken were not emotional, yet they carried a weight that slowly redefined every assumption built into the night. The coordinator confirmed that, in accordance with a pre-established governance structure and finalized equity activation protocols, controlling authority over Carter Group had been officially reassigned. The sentence hung in the air for a fraction of a second longer than normal speech would allow, giving the room just enough time to feel the shift before understanding it. Ethan's eyes narrowed slightly as he processed the terminology, searching for familiarity in language that suddenly felt unfamiliar. Beside him, Eva Johnson remained still, her posture unchanged, her attention forward but not reactive, as though she was not hearing something new, but confirming something already complete. The coordinator turned a page in the document and continued, stating clearly that the designated controlling shareholder and chief executive authority was Eva Johnson. The name entered the room without force, yet it altered every layer of perception instantly. Conversations did not erupt, they simply stopped, collapsing into silence as the meaning of what had been said spread through the audience like a quiet shockwave. Ethan did not speak. For the first time that evening, his expression lost its controlled composure entirely, replaced by a moment of disorientation that he could not immediately mask. He looked toward Eva, not with anger, but with a search for explanation that no longer matched the situation in front of him. Ava did not return his gaze. Instead, she remained focused on the stage, where the document was now being formally acknowledged by legal representatives who stepped forward to validate the announcement. The coordinator proceeded to outline the structure of the transition, explaining that the ownership transfer had been in effect through layered acquisitions and holding structures that had been activated according to predefined conditions. Each word clarified not only the present moment but also the history Ethan had believed he understood. Guests began to exchange subtle glances, realizing that the evening they had entered as a celebration was now something entirely different, though no one yet had a clear language for what it had become. Ethan finally spoke her name in a low voice, as if trying to anchor reality back into something familiar, but Eva did not respond immediately. The silence between them felt no longer personal, but structural, as if the space itself had changed ownership along with the company. When she finally turned her head slightly, it was not to acknowledge him as an equal in conversation, but to acknowledge the presence of a fact that no longer required discussion. The coordinator closed the document folder, signaling that the announcement was complete, yet the room remained suspended, unable to transition back into celebration. Ethan stood in place, no longer the center of attention, no longer the reference point of the evening, while Eva Johnson remained still in the exact position where perception had finally caught up to reality. And in that suspended moment, it became clear that nothing about the night would return to what it had been before the name was spoken. The silence in the hall did not break after the announcement, it only deepened, becoming a heavy stillness that pressed against every guest like an invisible weight that demanded understanding before reaction. Ethan Carter stood near the front of the room, no longer surrounded by the confidence of celebration, but by the unfamiliar sensation of being observed without control over the narrative. His eyes remained fixed forward, yet nothing in his expression carried certainty anymore. Around him, guests slowly shifted their attention, not speaking, not reacting loudly, but recalibrating their understanding of what this evening had become. Ava Johnson remained exactly where she stood, calm and unmoving, as if the shift in ownership had not altered her position but merely confirmed it. The earlier expectation that she was a guest in Ethan's world had dissolved completely, replaced by a realization that the structure of that world was no longer his to define. Ethan finally turned fully toward her, his voice lower now, stripped of its earlier ease, asking a question that carried more confusion than accusation. There was a brief pause before Eva responded, not with explanation, but with silence that carried its own authority. That silence did not feel like avoidance, it felt like confirmation. A few steps away, members of Ethan's executive team began to speak quietly among themselves, trying to interpret what the legal announcement had truly meant for their positions, their responsibilities, and their future within the company they thought they understood. The coordinator who had delivered the statement earlier stepped aside, allowing legal representatives to move forward with official documentation, reinforcing that what had been spoken was not symbolic, but structural and final. Ethan took a small step forward, as if trying to regain proximity to something familiar, but the space between him and Eva no longer felt personal. It felt institutional. Ava finally turned her head slightly toward him, not in response to emotion, but in acknowledgement of presence. When she spoke, her voice was steady and controlled, carrying no trace of urgency or conflict, only clarity. She did not explain the past in emotional terms, nor did she justify the present moment. Instead, she referenced structure, decisions, and long-established frameworks that had existed outside of his awareness. Each word made it clearer that what Ethan had considered independent success had always been part of a larger system he never fully saw. Around them, guests remained silent, many now understanding that the event they had attended as a celebration had become an official transition of authority. Some lowered their gaze, others simply stood frozen, unsure whether to remain or leave, as the atmosphere of the room shifted from social gathering to corporate reality. Ethan's expression tightened as fragments of realization began to form, not all at once, but in slow alignment with what was being said. He looked at Eva again, this time not searching for emotional connection, but for logical grounding. Yet what he saw was not distance or hostility, but composure so complete it left no space for negotiation. Ava's attention had already moved beyond him, briefly scanning the room. Acknowledging the structure she now formally controlled, not with triumph, but with finality. The weight of that recognition settled across the space more than any spoken word could have achieved. Ethan's earlier confidence, built from years of perceived control, no longer had a reference point within this new framework. As the legal representatives prepared to finalize procedural steps, the room slowly began to transition into a different phase, one where authority was no longer assumed but recorded and acknowledged. And in that transition, it became unmistakably clear that the distance between Ethan and Eva was no longer measured in personal history, but in the complete reversal of position that neither public setting nor private memory could undo. The final stage of the evening unfolded with a strange mixture of ceremony and inevitability, as if the room itself had accepted that what was happening could no longer be reversed by social comfort or emotional resistance. Ethan Carter stood among the guests who were now no longer behaving like attendees of a celebration, but like witnesses to a formal transition they had not been prepared to interpret. His posture remained upright, but the confidence that once defined his presence had become fragmented, replaced by a careful stillness that struggled to adapt to the new structure of reality forming around him. Across the room, Eva Johnson remained composed, her attention no longer fixed on individuals but on the entire system that now openly acknowledged her authority. Legal representatives moved with quiet precision near the stage, confirming final procedural steps, while staff adjusted documents and electronic confirmations that reinforced the announcement already made. The atmosphere no longer held anticipation, only verification. Ethan finally broke his silence, his voice lower than before, attempting to reassert familiarity through personal reference rather than structural understanding. He spoke of history, of shared effort, of moments he believed still carried relevance in this new context. Ava listened without interruption, her expression unchanged, as if she were hearing data rather than emotion. When she responded, it was not in contradiction or confrontation, but in clarification, referencing documented frameworks, contractual layers, and governance structures that had existed long before this evening. Each phrase widened the gap between perception and reality, revealing that what Ethan considered shared history had been, from the beginning, part of a larger system he had never fully accessed. Around them, guests began to understand that the event they were witnessing was not symbolic, but administrative in its final stage. Some lowered their gaze, others remained frozen, unsure whether silence was respect or disbelief. The coordinator at the podium confirmed that all legal requirements had been satisfied and that the transfer of controlling authority was now fully effective. Ethan's attention returned to Eva once more, this time without the expectation of recognition, but with the realization that recognition itself no longer defined the relationship between them. Ava's focus shifted briefly toward the stage where final acknowledgments were being recorded, her composure unchanged, her presence now aligned with the structure that had been formally established. In that moment, Ethan appeared less like a participant in the evening and more like someone observing a process that no longer required his approval to continue. The environment around them adjusted subtly as security personnel and executives acknowledged the new hierarchy through behavior rather than announcement. Conversations among guests became minimal, replaced by quiet observation of procedural finality. Ethan took a slow breath, as if attempting to steady himself within a framework that no longer responded to his expectations. Ava did not move toward him, nor did she distance herself. Instead, she remained exactly where authority had placed her, not through assertion, but through recognition by every system in the room that now aligned itself accordingly. The legal representative closed the final folder and confirmed that the transition was complete, marking the end of formal procedure. What remained was not conflict or resolution, but recalibration. Ethan stood in silence as the implications settled fully, no longer as information to be processed, but as reality to be lived. And in the quiet that followed, it became clear that the evening had not ended with an announcement, but with a permanent shift in balance that no one present could unhear or undo. The final moments of the evening carried a stillness that felt different from everything that had come before, as if the room itself had accepted a new order without needing further confirmation. Guests remained in place, no longer reacting with surprise or confusion, but with quiet awareness that the structure of power they had assumed at the beginning of the night had fully transformed. Ethan Carter stood among them, no longer the center of attention, but someone repositioned within a system that no longer responded to his expectations. His earlier attempts to interpret the situation through personal history had faded into silence, replaced by the unavoidable clarity of what had been officially established. Across the room, Eva Johnson remained composed, her presence steady and unchanged, no longer defined by her relationship to anyone in the space but by the authority that had been formally recognized. There was no visible celebration, no emotional display, only a calm finality that settled over every corner of the hall. The legal representatives completed their final procedural steps, confirming that all documentation had been filed and that the transition of control was fully effective under governing authority protocols. With that confirmation, the event no longer functioned as a gathering but as a recorded moment in corporate history. Ethan finally broke his silence, but his voice no longer carried confidence or expectation. It carried the weight of realization that arrived too late to change anything already set in motion. He looked at Eva, not searching for the past, but trying to understand the present, yet the distance between them no longer operated on emotional terms. It operated on structural terms that could not be reversed through conversation or memory. Eva turned slightly toward him, not in acknowledgement of conflict, but in acknowledgement that the conversation itself no longer held the same meaning it once did. Her expression remained steady, her composure unchanged, as if everything that had unfolded had already been accounted for long before this moment existed. Around them, guests began to quietly shift their attention toward exits and conversations, as the formal purpose of the evening had concluded and only its consequences remained. The coordinator gave a final nod to the legal team, signaling that all records were now officially sealed. In that closing motion, the room seemed to release its tension, not through resolution, but through completion. Ethan stood still, no longer attempting to assert presence or reclaim interpretation, but simply absorbing the reality that had replaced his assumptions. Eva's attention moved away from him for the final time, not as rejection, but as transition into what came next beyond the boundaries of this space. There was no need for further explanation, no need for dialogue that could not alter what had already been finalized. The night ended not with applause, nor with confrontation, but with a quiet acknowledgement that ownership, identity, and position had all been redefined in a single irreversible sequence. And as the last guest slowly began to leave the hall, it became clear that what had unfolded was not a turning point in a story still continuing, but the closing of one structure and the beginning of another that no one present could any longer deny.